And we'll get Louise to introduce that gentleman in a few moments. But most of you have been associated with the Friends for a while, I'm sure. So the Friends support the mission of the Canadian War Museum. Our objective is to raise funds for various programs for the War Museum. So your contributions and efforts and dedication to our organization are very, very much appreciated. So I won't take much more time. I think it's far more interesting to listen to our up and coming speaker. So again, thank you very much for participating today. And Louise, over to you to get the show really going. Thank you.
First thing I have to do is bring the microphone down. Second thing I have to do is find my little picture right here. So folks, I have the pleasure of introducing this afternoon Dr. Tim to you. As you know, he is a historian here at the museum. He of course is a Canadian military history historian and author. I know he has published at least 13 books. It might be 14 now with this one, I'm not sure. But I knew at least 13. And I also want to highlight for you that he's a two-time recipient, both in 2000 and 2015 of the C.P. Stacey Prize, a two-time recipient of the J.D. Defoe Book Prize, and a three-time winner of the Ottawa Book Prize. He's highly, highly respected author and historian. He has been elected to the Royal Society of Canada in 2019, and he's also a member of the Order of Canada. So it's a great pleasure that I introduce to you this afternoon, Dr. Tim Cook.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And it's always a great pleasure to be back here speaking to the Friends. I've known many of you for 20 years or beyond. And the work that you do is so important for the museum. And I think so important for Canadians as a whole. I've spoken about many of my books. I was looking back at my resume, The Secret History of Soldier. I talked about supernatural battlefields, the Vimy book before that, some as well, but we missed the Fight for History because it came out during COVID. And in that book, as some of you may know, I talk about the importance of the Friends in stimulating discussion to ensure that there would be a new Canadian War Museum back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So it is a great pleasure to be here and to see all of you in person. And isn't it interesting that we're able to do these hybrid events? I have to advance slides here, and there are others, so there may be some technical challenges. I do want to point out our CEO, Caroline Dorleguet, who's here. Thank you, Caroline, for coming. She just received a very high honor for the Belgian embassy. I think it was the Order of Belgium, and it is a very significant and distinguished award. So how nice that you could join us. Yeah. Now, I'll be talking about my new book, which you can see here, Lifesavers and Body Snatchers. And I've been studying and thinking about the medical war in the Great War for about 20 years now, and grappling with the idea, maybe the contradictions of sending soldiers into battle to be maimed and killed, and then to expect other service personnel, doctors and nurses, to care for them, to repair those bodies and to soothe their minds, and if possible, to send them back into the fighting. One Canadian soldier, stressing the seeming contradictions of medicine and war, wrote this: "On the one hand, it is science straining every nerve to accomplish man's destruction. On the other hand, it is science working overtime to save his life." Now, war history is filled with such scorching contradictions, but they certainly emerged in this study of the Lifesavers and Body Snatchers. And the second part of that title, the Body Snatchers, will become more apparent in a bit. There we go. Good. Now, as many of you know from my previous books, I believe it's important to hear from the eyewitnesses to history. I have spent my career reading the letters and the diaries and the memoirs of soldiers and sailors and nurses and doctors and others. I've spoken to veterans most of my adult life. There's power in those words, and I allow those words to guide me in my research in the archives and in other places. And I want to just put a shout out to our Military History Research Center here at the War Museum, which is such a powerful place of history, a site where Canadians can know about the past and where we can preserve those letters and the diaries. And again, the Friends donate significant money to keep that mission and mandate going forward. I also believe in the power of images, and this is one from an exhibition I curated with Jack Granestein, Victory 1918, and we colorized this image. And the Canadian First World War images are all black and white, and there's a bit of a debate about that. I think it helps people to make connections, and I think there is a great resonance in these historical photographs. And there'll be a lot of photographs that you'll have a chance to see today, and also to hear from me. Now, one writer said of the Canadian medical services in the Great War, which I should emphasize went from 20 staff to over 20,000 during the course of the war. And this included doctors and surgeons and specialists in all manner of care and nurses. One comment of this enormous organization was that it was a great machine of healing. And I like that term, machine, the complexity of this organization. And I'll share some of that with you today. But it was also a machine that learned and evolved during the course of the war, and that they engaged in absolutely crucial preventive medicine. And that's a point that emerged during the war, because this was, in the writing of this book, because I wrote this book during COVID. I began to think about this topic in April of 2020. We remember that fraught period of great fear where we were worried for our loved ones and for ourselves. Yep. Okay. And you know, the past doesn't change, but the way that the historian approaches the past is often influenced by what is happening in the present. And that was certainly the case here, where I went back to the history, starting with the pandemic of 1918, 1919, to think about how those Canadians dealt with that terrible strain that killed 55,000 Canadians. And when this book came out in September of 22, and I was talking a little bit about it, I think the figure of Canadians killed at the time was about 30,000. I think I just saw that it's up to 52,000. And so we continue to lose Canadians to this terrible virus. But I found that there were great parallels to exploring the past and trying to draw some connections to the present. And in fact, the role of the doctors in preventive medicine, which is now called force protection, we still have a medical service that cares for our service personnel, is absolutely crucial. And in fact, one Canadian doctor, McGill professor George Adami, who served in uniform, is actually an important character in my book. He wrote, "The great outstanding feature of the war has been the triumph of preventive medicine." And I want to come back to that. This image, by the way, is from 1919 in Alberta. And you know, look at the masks there. Aren't there parallels to what we have? I remember, Carolyn, you and I, very early in the pandemic, still touring VIPs through, everyone wearing different mishmashed masks and trying to figure out what we were going to do and how we were going to keep each other safe. My desire to write this book was also because I was chasing a medical mystery that I had been exploring for the better part of 20 years. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but as this image indicates, it involves the shocking story of the collection of soldiers' body parts, Canadian soldiers' body parts, the extraction of bones and of hearts, as we see here, and lungs and brains. And I'm going to talk more about this, but I spent years looking for this story at the National Archives. Not every day, I have a day job, and I wrote a few books in between. But every time I was researching, I would keep in mind this story that I tried to track down. And these records were hidden or misplaced, I should say, at the National Archives. I finally found them, and they confirmed this story that I talk about in the book, which, as I will come back to, involves the removal of 799 body parts from Canadian and British soldiers and sent back to Canada for a medical museum that was never built. I'll talk more about that, but this image gives you a sense of some of the body parts that were removed. Now, to get back to the war, From Canada, a country of not yet 8 million, at least 620,000 Canadians served, which 3,000 were nurses. The Great War forever changed Canada, and that deep commitment led to the creation of new symbols, legends, and heroes. It also unleashed terrible trauma and death, while propelling us forward to new nationhood. Nearly tore us apart as well along regional linguistic fault lines, while leaving us forever transformed. Now that's the legacy of the war. That's a different talk, but it gives you just a glimpse of, I think, one of the reasons why more than 100 years later, we still talk about the war. It still matters to us. And we can explore that in the question period if you have some questions about that. This massive force, which was raised from Canada's citizen soldiers, largely from ordinary men coming from every town, every city, every village, all classes, almost all religions, included as well the recruitment of doctors. And isn't this a tremendous poster here with the messaging that we see? And we have an amazing collection, as many of you know, of the First and Second World War posters here at the museum. They are visually stunning. The messaging is fascinating, and it gives great insight, I think, into how people thought or what they were subjected to in terms of imagery and encouragement in support of the war. In the terms of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, as I mentioned, thousands of Canadian doctors enlisted. In fact, half of all Canadian doctors served in uniform. And they would soon find that they were more than simply doctors in uniform, aiding the sick and the wounded. They were, in fact, part of a military system and often had to act as disciplinarians. There they faced contradictions. And this idea of contradictions, I have found, emerges in this study and in so many studies of war. With half of all Canadian doctors serving, about a third of all of Canada's nurses also served. They were commissioned officers, unlike their British counterparts, and they were responsible for the care of the wounded and in many other roles. They became dietitians. They were involved in physiotherapy. They assisted in surgery and in post-surgical care. They are featured prominently in my book. Now, to return perhaps to the story of disease and vaccinations and enforced protection. One Canadian doctor wrote during the war, "In every war, the soldier faces two enemies. The one is the armed forces of the foe with their terrible engines of destruction. The other, the silent, and in the past, the far greater foe, the grim purveyor of death, disease." Now, during the American Civil War of 1861 to 65, with its increased firepower and over 2,000 land battles, disease still killed more soldiers than shot or shell. And in fact, in almost every war in human history, disease has killed more, and certainly every long and prolonged war, than weapons of the day or the time. And at the start of this war, the Canadian doctors were aware of the challenges that disease might claim this army before it even was sent overseas. And we've got two amazing images here. One is of the Canadians at Valcartier, so south of Quebec City, where the first contingent came together, 35,000 strong. And there was great fear here that these 35,000 soldiers and 10,000 horses might become a vector for disease and lead to tremendous death and loss. It didn't happen. The doctors were involved in sanitary measures. That involved the unglamorous work of making sure that human and animal feces goes in the right place and doesn't infect water supplies, and other aspects, including vaccination. And isn't this an amazing image of a Canadian soldier receiving his vaccination? He doesn't look too happy there. But that's because they used the same needle over and over again. And maybe he was somewhere far down the line. But there was an understanding that the scourge of bacteria and viruses could wipe out the Canadian Expeditionary Force before it even went overseas. And so these vaccinations I write about in the book, and again, another fascinating link to what we were living through only 2 years ago. In the Canadian Expeditionary Force, they had mandatory vaccinations. And the study showed that they worked, these vaccinations, in protecting against some of the great killers of people of that time and killers of armies in history, smallpox and typhoid. And in fact, one doctor wrote that the soldier who refused to receive the vaccination was removed from the forces. He was not, I quote, allowed to endanger the health of his comrades. Now, the medical services went overseas with the Canadian Expeditionary Force. They were in England. There was a major medical crisis I write about in the book where meningitis broke out in the camps, and the doctors did all the right things and separated them. There wasn't a lot of treatment for meningitis at the time, but they ensured that meningitis did not run through the ranks. And to those of you who know your history of late 1914, the Canadians were in the mud and the filth of Salisbury Plain, and disease was a great problem. And the doctors really showed that they could keep the casualties, as they were called, to a minimal loss rate. The Canadian division went overseas in February of 1915 and fought its first major battle at Ypres. And we see the smashed Ypres cloth tower here, which was in Ypres, and then a very rare photograph of the Canadians in the trenches. You don't see a lot of photographs from 1915. Now, why? Because having a camera was illegal in the trenches. They feared that the photographs would be passed on to the enemy as usable intelligence. It was about as useless as telling soldiers not to write letters and diaries. They did that, but it took a brave person to keep a Kodak camera. This is a very rare. Do you notice anything about this photograph? No helmets. Yeah, that's right. So the helmet would not be introduced until April of 1916. And doctors recommended as well in many studies that helmets had to be introduced. There were so many head wounds that they were encountering. The first major battle is unleashed on the 22nd of April, 1915. I hope you recognize this print, Richard Jack's Second Battle of Ypres. It's in our permanent galleries. It's a stunning work of art. It's about 22 feet long and 12 feet tall. And I think it's a powerful work. Art historians don't always love it. It's come under some critical analysis. Jack wasn't at the battlefield, but he did depict the battle, I think, in a very interesting way. You see the German soldiers coming forward, that smoke or poison gas. There are wounded Canadians. There are dead Canadians in the foreground. It's not a sanitized work, I think. It depicts the chaos and carnage of battle. And this is what the Canadians faced over about 4 brutal days of fighting from the 22nd to the 26th of April. They were subjected to massive German artillery bombardments and all of the destruction of the modern battlefield. Bullets and shrapnel ripped through flesh and organs, while high explosive shells dismembered bodies and collapsed internal organs. One of the Canadian doctors, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Watt, was in a field ambulance, and he wrote this: "It was one never-ending stream that lasted all day and night for 7 days without cessation. In all, some 5,200 cases passed through our hands, 5,200 in a week. Wounds here, wounds there, wounds everywhere. Legs, feet, hands missing, bleeding stumps controlled by rough field tourniquets, large portions of the abdominal wall shot away, faces horribly mutilated, bones shattered to pieces, holes that you could put your clenched fist into." That is war. That is the brutality of war. And I think, as an aside, if you'll permit me, it is the role of the historian to ensure that we talk about war in all of its complexity, the heroics and the horror, the brutal and the brutality, and the banality of war, and so much more. Now, at Second Ypres, you'll remember the Germans unleashed chlorine gas for the first time in the history of warfare. I suppose they used it on the Eastern Front in late 1914 against the Russians in shells, but the Russians didn't even know they were being gassed. They unleashed it here. This is a photograph from 1916. There are no photographs of the German gas attack in April of 1915, but it was a horror show. No one understood poison gas, chlorine gas, which burned out the soldiers' lungs, and the doctors themselves were mystified in treating the victims. Later in the war, doctors learned through the study of dying gas soldiers that oxygen helped for some of them, which could be administered both orally and anally. And there were other treatments to help reduce some of the ghastly wounds. But throughout the war, there was an evolution in deadlier gases and delivery systems, moving from these massive canister attacks to gas shells that could be fired in a more tactical manner. And then, of course, in 1917, the Germans again upended everything and unleashed mustard gas. And mustard gas changed the war, because up to that point, soldiers had been issued a respirator. They were told it would keep them safe, but mustard gas was a persistent agent that burned the skin and caused the terrible blisters like we see here, or the burns to the left of the soldiers. And in fact, mustard gas sometimes transformed soldiers into living weapons. Their uniforms were impregnated with the gas, and when they were brought back, they gassed the doctors and the nurses who were caring for them, who often suffered burns to their hands, suffered temporary blindness, and had their hair turn yellow. To return then to Second Deep, the Canadian division of 18,000 strong suffered 6,000 casualties in 4 days of battle. The number of wounded pouring in is frightful, wrote Surgeon William Boyd in his private diary. All the talk about glory and glamour of war is rather apt to stick in one's throat. He also wrote that the politicians and generals who started this war, if they spent 1 hour in a field ambulance, they would find a way to end the fighting. Now, as the war progressed, the doctors and surgeons and nurses and other caregivers were forced to put in place a medical system to get the wounded from the front to the rear. This is one of many images that shows that. No man's land would be at the top. You would have stretcher bearers who would carry in the wounded, or the wounded soldiers would crawl or walk or limp their way back. The regimental aid post, the RAP at the top, was where a battalion medical officer would care for some of the wounded. But the idea was to send the wounded back along this chain to an advanced dressing station, usually 1 kilometer behind the line, or a casualty clearing station 8 to 10 kilometers behind the line, where surgery was often conducted for the first time, or further back to the base hospitals, which could be hundreds of kilometers behind the lines. And they were connected by road systems and rail lines. There were horse-drawn ambulances and mechanized ambulances, and this became a very sophisticated means of moving the wounded away from the front so that they could be cared for. And of course, it was a fight against time, against the loss of blood and shock. As I mentioned, those stretcher bearers play such a crucial role in carrying out the wounded. And I talk about them in the book, the training they went through, the incredible strength required to carry off a wounded soldier who was wet, and his equipment could add another 50 pounds, even though they cut away everything they could. This, as I mentioned, was a race against time. I also recount in the book stories of the soldiers who, with some incredible survival impulse, pulled themselves off the battlefield, sometimes with broken legs and broken arms, with their entrails falling out. Somehow that survival instinct to keep going and to make their way back, because they understood that they were dying and that they had to receive care, or it would be all over. Now, there were all manner of ghastly sights as steel and iron tore through bodies. And not all wounds were equal, we need to point out. Some bullets passed through bodies, through and through, they were called. They would pass through and out the other side. And remarkably, a soldier like that, if no organs or bones were hit, could be back in the line within about 6 weeks. More often, though, bullets hit the body, tumbling through it, shattering bone, sending those bone fragments throughout the body as additional killing agents, ripping organs, and often exiting the body in a burst of gore. Shell fragments, the weirdly twisted metal, caused the most complex wounds. And those of you who have been through Gallery 2, we have an image there of the difference between a bullet wound and a shell fragment. In addition to these complex wounds that doctors faced, they dragged in bits of dirt and uniform into the wound. And this is the age before antibiotics. Most of the wounds were infected, and the results were ghastly as gangrene surged through the body. This was a new feature for doctors. They hadn't seen this in the South African War. And most of these doctors, since they're coming from civilian practice, they're never encountering wounds like this. So there's this massive learning curve that they have to encounter to save the lives. And in fact, sometimes people ask me, if you'll permit me another aside, Tim, Dr. Cook, what time period would you like to live in? Everyone thinks because I study the trenches that I would like to have lived in the trenches. And I always say any period where there was antibiotics. Now, in 1915, these infections raging through the wounds killed countless patients as doctors watched on with impotence. And they began to experiment new liquids that they would try to clean out the wounds, iodines, various chemical solutions. They settled on a solution of cutting out great swaths of flesh and muscle. And they just kept cutting and cutting and cutting. And I think these two images I find very powerful. The one on the left of a very, very badly wounded soldier, and the image on the right of two soldiers whose presumably infections kept going, required that their legs be amputated. That guy, we know who he is, the young guy on the left there. He enlisted when he was 16. He was a double amputee by the age of 18. Now, throughout the war, as I've mentioned, there is this evolution in treatment. And this is the war where the X-ray is introduced really for the first time and becomes absolutely crucial to discovering fragments and metal in the body. And this is a really rare photograph of a soldier with a head wound, and they're doing an X-ray, presumably to determine his shattered skull. Wounds to the abdomen or the brain in 1914 or 1915 were almost always lethal. Almost no one survived them. By 1917 and 1918, those patients were routinely being saved. There is this evolution in care. I don't have enough time to talk about it, but it is recounted in the book. As part of that care was the introduction of blood transfusions. Again, another radical departure from the past. Canadians were at the forefront of this. A number of Canadian doctors, especially on the Somme. It is generally thought that 1916 is the year where blood transfusions were really being experimented with, although I've found that the McGill Hospital, which was raised at McGill University, was doing blood transfusions in late 1915. So there is this constant evolution in care, and by 1918, blood transfusions are routinely saving soldiers' lives. There are other innovations like moving surgery forward. They were initially done at those base hospitals, often several hundred kilometers behind the lines. They moved forward to the casualty clearing stations, usually 10 to 12 kilometers behind the lines. And that forward care helped to save lives, generally from shock and loss of blood, but also from traumatic wounds. Doctors play other roles, and I've talked a little bit about surgeons and others, but there were doctors in the frontline trenches. They were often involved in caring for their soldiers. This is a great photograph of a doctor inspecting soldiers' feet. That too, again, unglamorous, like dealing with latrines and other aspects of public health and sanitary measures. This helped to prevent what was known as trench foot. And there's a really ghastly image, which I pulled out at the last moment because I figured we don't need to see that, of toes rotting off. And that was a concern as they stood in the slush and the mud of the trenches on the Western Front. And this is just one of many stories of the key roles I note of doctors in this preventive care. Now, in the book, I discuss other aspects, the culture of patients in hospitals. Those of you who know my book, The Secret History of Soldiers, know how I talked about the culture of soldiers, the creation of songs and poetry and theater shows, and there are trench newspapers and superstitions and all of that hidden history, I argue, which is so important to understanding both the soldiers' culture, but also how they coped and endured. And the same occurs in the hospital wards. They created art, they had songs and poetry. It's riven through with a very dark gallows humor. But isn't this a great image? This is from the Queen's Hospital Most of the universities at the time raised hospitals. These guys are knitting. And of course, that's good for the hands. It's good to pass the time. You can send it home to your loved one. But I like this image because both of these guys had legs, broken femurs. And as I mentioned earlier, brain wounds and gut wounds in 1914 and 15 were almost always lethal. So too, which surprised me, were broken femurs, especially high breaks. They usually became infected and they lost those soldiers. These guys, I think, have high break femurs. Nonetheless, they have survived. This is a photo from 1917. So it shows, again, some of that evolution of treatment through a different source, through a photograph in this case. There remained these improvements to surgery, caring for lives, and the doctors in the trenches, as I've alluded to, in caring for the soldiers, had a really key role in keeping up morale. And I think this is one of the questions that has plagued me, would be too strong a word, but that I have tried to uncover over now 25 years of exploring history. It is, how do soldiers, and think of sailors and airmen and others, how do they survive? How do they withstand the strain? How do they cope and endure? You'll see that in almost all of my books and many of the exhibitions that I have worked on as well. That very powerful human element, for me, has always driven my desire to understand the experience of these men and women. And the role of the doctors is absolutely crucial in morale. Soldiers will often fight and accept the orders, even in the most desperate of situations. The worst being probably charge that machine gun nest so that a flanking platoon or section can move around. They do that, but there is a social contract. They understand that if they are to be wounded in battle, that they will be cared for. And that you see in letters and diaries in subtle ways, but it's something that I draw out in this book, and the key role of morale that these doctors play in sustaining. Now, with the wounded passing over these field ambulances in massive numbers, 5,200, you'll remember, Second Deep. On the Somme, 24,000 casualties. At Vimy, the Great Victory, 10,602 casualties in 4 days. The other victory at Hill 70 in August of 1917, 11,000 casualties. And when we talk about casualties, it tends to be one killed for every 2 wounded. Although in my book, I explore how that changes, especially in the 100 Days campaign, those final battles at the end of the war. The ratio was 1 killed to 5 wounded. And I talk about that. And one of the reasons why we could save more of those soldiers, why they weren't in the killed category, was because of the role of the medical services and the advances that they underwent during the course of the war. So there is a constant learning process, but it is a learning process, I need to point out, that is done in blood. It is learning from those soldiers who could not be saved. And there was no shortage of wounded soldiers. And in the book, I talk about other aspects like patient rehabilitation and the heroics of care and hospitals under fire. But I think it's worth saying, of the 424,000 soldiers who went overseas, and of which about 360,000 made it to the Western Front, around 140,000 of them were wounded. But in this war of long odds, 9 out of 10 wounded soldiers survived if they made it to medical care. I'll repeat that, 9 out of 10 survived if they made to medical care. Hidden in those statistics, however, are those who died in no man's land, in the forward trenches, in the field ambulances, as they were sent back. And as some of you know, we lost 60,000 Canadians killed during the course of the war, and about 6,000 Canadians who died in the aftermath, some of them from their wounds. Nonetheless, in this war of long odds, as I have said, 9 out of 10 is an astonishing success. And yet the doctors did not succeed on all fronts. Shell shock was a perplexing wound for the soldiers, the doctors, and the senior commanders. One nursing sister, Sophie Horner, wrote, "I am witnessing terrible suffering. Some of them," the soldiers she referred to, "go right to pieces. Their nerves have gone and they cry like babies." And I talk about shell shock and the evolution of treatment. And one of the interesting aspects, I think, of shell shock is that later in the war, it seemed to pit the high command against the doctors. because the high command, and that's a kind of broad and maybe unfair term, didn't understand these mental wounds. And the doctors often said the best treatment is rest and talk therapy, Freudian therapy. And that's not what the high command wanted. They wanted those soldiers back in the line. So there's a great tension there that I think we can talk about in the question period, if that interests you. Venereal disease was another wound that was not easy to combat. And the Canadians had very high rates during the course of the war. Want more venereal disease? Okay. I've been saving that line the whole time. The high command turned to the medical services again to control what they called the leprosy of lust. And there's a wonderful morality tracks, which we have actually in our MHRC of the YMC and other organizations that tried to curb the impulses of soldiers. They didn't really succeed very well, judging by the statistics of venereal disease and its transmission. And yet the doctors play a key role here. And they, again, were advocating for the issuing of prophylactics and lectures and things like that. And the high command was very uncomfortable with these things because, of course, and it's really interesting, there's a quote in my book where they say, we receive more correspondence about the fear around venereal disease than any other thing. Think of the soldiers who are ripped open, young boys having their legs removed, and yet mental wounds and everything else, it's venereal disease that is the great fear, because it was on the home front, the separation of loved ones that lead to absence and all kinds of miseries. And this, I think, as I talk about in the book, was not a success for the medical corps. The third area where I think they failed, and self-admittedly so, was in combating the killer flu of 1918. 55,000 Canadians were killed, and at least 1,500 soldiers in uniform. Now, they didn't know what the flu was. They didn't know it was a virus. They thought it was a bacteria. The medical services, in fact, engaged in some of the right things. They separated soldiers with the virus. They tried to wear masks around them. And yet, consistently, like our caregivers in 2020, 2021, 22, and 23, they cared for the wounded soldiers, who often infected the nurses and the doctors who were trying to save their lives. Now, there's more to the story, but I want to get to the last part of the book, which is the evolution and the constant learning process. This is a great image, I think, of a pathologist looking through his microscope. And I was surprised to find in my research there were medical conferences behind the lines, that doctors traveled giving lectures on the newest care and treatment. I should have understood that, but I just hadn't thought about that. Medical pamphlets were published during the war. Doctors were encouraged to publish in academic journals. And all of this was fodder for my book and the research there. It also included the autopsy of fallen soldiers. And this is the story that I have mentioned, which I encountered 20 or 25 years ago in a doctor's journal, where he seemed to be hinting that they were not only autopsying soldiers, but removing pathological samples. And that was the story I looked for. In 2010, I co-curated an exhibition, War and Medicine, with Dr. Andrew Birch, friend and colleague here. We uncovered it again, continued to look, couldn't find it until after years of searching, I did find it at the National Archives. And it revealed to me the shocking revelation that indeed doctors, Canadian doctors, were involved in a British program to harvest the body parts of slain soldiers, hearts, lungs, bones, and organs for a future medical museum here in Ottawa. This was done without the soldiers' consent, and it is not mentioned on their personnel files. So if you were to look up the soldier, there's no mention there that soldier may have had his brain removed or his spine or something like that. I have identified a number of these soldiers in the book, and I talk about them, and we need to keep in mind, however, that consent was not an issue 1914 to 1918. And in fact, when you enlisted, when you signed the attestation paper, your body was owned by the state, or by the army in this case. And my colleague, Dr. Tracy Iacobelli at the back, has written a brilliant book on firing squads and crime and punishment during the Great War. And yet I think this story had disappeared from our history books. And so it's always nice and challenging when you uncover something quite new and quite radical, I think. The fact that, again, slain Canadian soldiers were having their body parts removed, sent to London, where they were put on display, and then back to Canada, the end of the war. 799 body parts. This is some of those body parts put on display in Montreal. Two photographs side by side. In the foreground of the left, you can see bone fragments that have been removed from soldiers. You can see hands. These are plaster hands that had been torn apart by shrapnel or bullets. We see facial plasters of reconstructed faces, and that's a part of the story I talk about in the book. Some very difficult images. And on the other side of this, I know from the catalog, were the wet samples, they called them. Those were the organs, the hearts, the brain, the lungs. They're very interested in mustard gas lungs. Now, as a historian, you grapple with these issues. How do you make sense of this? You need to understand them in the context of the time. And yet I think what is so fascinating about this story, and we can talk more about this if you're interested, was that this was not a secret. These were not mad scientists doing this on the sly. Although I have a couple of interesting stories of one medical student serving overseas who was collecting bones and recreating a skeleton under his bed in his hospital. And he writes to his mom and he says, "I'm almost finished my skeleton." And then he goes in writing something like, "Maybe I shouldn't be doing this." Don't know what happened to them. But this was not a secret. They were in Canada. They were supposed to be for a medical museum built here in Ottawa. That was supposed to be the Canadian War Museum. In fact, it was going to be a wing of it, bringing the priceless art back and the artifacts. We never built that museum, as you know. The War Museum was not erected until 1942, and then the major one at Sussex in 66. And so I track what happened to these body parts. Now, I'm a historian. Historians often go to the back of the book first, look at all the footnotes, and then they read the conclusion. It's mental and wrong. I write literary nonfiction, as many of you know. There's a story that's unfolding here. So I don't want to give away everything on these body parts. But if you'd like, we can talk a bit more about this. What I want to draw your attention to, I think, is how should we think of the fallen after the war? This was a period where we ennobled the dead. John McCrae's poem in Flanders Fields. On the right is the Nurses' Memorial at Parliament. Think of the poppy and Armistice Day and later Remembrance Day in 1931. Think of the stained glass windows, the rise of the Legion in 1925, commemorative histories. How could we be doing that? And on the other hand, say it was okay to bring back the body parts of these slain soldiers and continue to expect that they would serve beyond death as medical teaching tools. I leave that with you, but it might be something for us to talk about or for us to reflect on our glorious dead, as this 1917 Union government, that was the combination of the Conservatives and the win the war English Liberals, implies. And no posters, I'll say facetiously, highlighting the fact that you as a young man might serve and go overseas and fight against the Hun and die in battle in the liberation of France, and then that your body parts would be extracted from your corpse and put on display, and that you would serve forever as a medical sample. I'll finish up here with some final thoughts on the legacy. And some of you who know my book, I'm very interested in the legacies of war. You can see that in Vimy and The Secret History, and especially The Fight for History. And I thought the legacies of the medical war, quite profound and really astonishing. One doctor wrote, "The war gave us a new social conscience." I think about half of Canadian doctors serving overseas, they come back, they bring all these lessons, dealing with tremendous wounds. One of the things was that there was a new focus on public health, especially preventive diseases. Vaccines were emphasized in the literature in the 1920s and having saved soldiers' lives, and now they should be applied to civilians. There was a new state medical system. The Department of Health was established in 1919. We create a whole medical system for the wounded veterans who come back. There are prosthetic factories making limbs, of which you see a couple of stunning photographs, one stunning photograph here, and this idea of helping to reestablish the veteran. There was John McCrae, of course, probably the most famous doctor, who didn't make it back, who died in January of 1918. But one of his last lectures, which is saved to us in history from a medical student who heard him and was so inspired by John McCrae, who of course was a pre-war lecturer at McGill. McCrae said, understanding his fame as a poet within Flanders Fields, what he said was, if I have one enduring hope, it is to come back to Canada and to ensure that Canadians embrace vaccination. As he said, that is what would save the greatest number of lives. There are other advances. Physiotherapy, of course, goes through tremendous changes. Blood transfusions were used to help cancer victims. X-rays were used to determine tuberculosis, which was the great killer of Canadians aged 18 to 45. Healthcare professionals had a new focus on maternal health. Out of this great war of destruction is a new desire to ensure that babies survive. And they use the language of war. They talk about infant soldiers who must go on. And they talk about the need to replace the 66,000 Canadians who died during the war, of arming mothers with education, because they were the first line of defense for the helpless infant soldier. Plastic surgery went through massive advances. But I'll leave you maybe with one last thought, and it comes from Colonel George Armstrong, who was a doctor during the war, who remarked, medicine has advanced, but at what a cost? Thank you for coming. I'm happy to take any questions. It was a 45-minute talk. If your bladder is feeling the urge, feel free to get up and relieve and walk around. But any questions, comments? Yes. What happened? So my story of being a literary nonfiction writer, no. What happened to them? Well, they came back to Canada. They went to McGill. They were put on display. They were seen as prized possessions. They were to be sent to Ottawa for this museum that was not built. But in 1922, the records reveal that D&D realizes it shouldn't have these body parts. And 22 is an important year. That's the year Walter Allward gets his commission for the Vimy Monument. That's the year where almost every community in this country is building memorials and monuments to the fallen. And it seems very clear that D&D wakes up and realizes it should not have these body parts. And they didn't want them destroyed, but they sent them, or they left them at McGill to be developed. And some of you may know the name Maud Abbott. She was a very famous Canadian doctor, an expert in heart surgery. She suffered terrible sexism her whole life. She was a tremendous doctor, but never able to rise up at McGill especially. She worked on this collection. You'll remember who was the principal of McGill University from 1921 to 33. It's Sir Arthur Currie, the Corps commander. I find those contradictions very interesting. So what happened to them? Well, they remained there after the Second World War. They were not used during the Second World War to educate medical officers. And so some of the Dean of Arts or the Dean of Science said, we don't need these things. And they were passed around unceremoniously. And eventually they end up at one of the Canadian Forces bases where they are supposed to go into a pathology museum, and then they were unceremoniously destroyed in at least 1959 or beyond. And I leave with you, what was the obligation of those members of the Canadian Forces to those body parts? Maybe nothing. Maybe a respectful burial. Maybe something else. And that was one of the things I wrestled with in the book. Yeah.
So just preempt, if you could, well, first of all, you have a comment online that's brilliant and inspiring.
Thank you.
Which I'm sure we'd all agree. If you could just comment, because they can hear you, that if anybody watching online has any questions, put them into the chat.
Okay.
I'll repeat.
Thank you. Yeah. So if you have any questions, please, those in Zoom land, please put them into the chat, and someone will read them out, and I'd be happy to answer them as well. And thank you again for sticking with us. Yeah. Yes. Mhm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And there are tremendous changes and improvements during the course of the war. But as scholars who have studied this, it doesn't appear to have worked its way back through much of society. And if there's something I have heard in traveling this country and speaking to Canadians, it is the fathers and grandfathers and occasionally grandmothers of the two world wars who came back, with mental injuries. We know that now. We know PTSD, but it was not recognized officially, as many of you know, until 1980. It took the Vietnam War and Vietnam veterans to bring that forward. And so it's very slow evolution in care. During the Second World War, it's called battle stress or lack of moral fiber for those who flew in the bombers who could no longer continue to fly. And often they were treated quite brutally, certainly the airmen who were stripped of their rank and publicly humiliated. It was so common in Normandy that 1 in 4 non-lethal battle casualties was battle stress. So we know that in every war there are invisible wounds. I think what is much harder to track is what happens to veterans when they return home. What is the care that they receive? We've got a great project, shamelessly plug this, in their own voices, which the Friends have contributed to, and thank you. And it is an oral history project for those online and here who don't know, to interview veterans. And we have interviewed to date, I think, 146 veterans from the Second World War, Korean War, early Cold War, peacekeeping operations, all the way up to Afghanistan. And it is less about what people did during the war. It is more about what was the veteran's experience? What happened when you came back? How did you think about the war? How did your family react to you? And this is an amazing, amazing project we have. And you'll see the fruits of this in a major online web portal in late 2024. And we're going to have a conference on veterans in 2025. Any other questions? Is there anything online? Yeah.
Sorry, I hope you don't like it. Comment. Tim Cook is a national treasure. Every presentation that I have attended of his has been indeed brilliant and inspiring.
Thank you.
But I'll follow that up with a question.
But he is awful today.
Everybody. Did you come across Dr. Tate McKenzie in your research?
I did, thank you. Tate McKenzie, many of you may know as a great sculptor, but he was, of course, a pioneer in physiotherapy. And when I go to Elmont, where I have some family, there's a wonderful memorial there, I think called The Soldier. And it's very powerful. And we have some of Tate McKenzie's works in our holdings. We're in the gallery, yes, yeah, they're amazing. And he's an amazing figure, and he is in the book. Although, like all historians and curators, there is only so much that one can say. But I did want to, I write about him, I think, in the legacy section, where I do talk about the impact of this war in advancing physiotherapy. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's a good question. Those are wounded soldiers coming back from the battlefields at Passchendaele. So in October or November of 1917, and I quite like it. I quite like it because it shows to me the shared humanity, I think, of these soldiers in this wasteland of destruction. German prisoners, as these two soldiers clearly are, as I talk about in the book, were conscripted to carry in wounded soldiers. Right, I just did a lot of backward bidding. Did it go? No. Okay. Well, you'll have to go out and buy a copy of the book to take a look at the cover. But I will say that I don't get to choose the cover of my books. My publisher takes into account what I think, and I like seeing soldiers' faces. I think that's really important. But it's interesting. Earlier in my publishing career, I used to push some of the war art here because I love the war art, and you don't see a lot of art on the cover of books, and they say it doesn't sell. So there's something to learn. You had another follow-up? Was there no? Oh, that is exactly why they were collected. They are there as pathological samples for study, to learn, because how do you learn? Before the age of imaging inside the body, you have to look inside the body. So there is a reason, again, these are not mad scientists. There's a reason why you collect these pathological samples. There's a long history of this. And yet, I believe there is a problem here. Yes. Oh, sorry, sir. We're going to move on. Maybe we'll come back around. Yeah. 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 Well, I wrestled with that. I wondered what is my role as a historian? What is my obligation? I uncovered this story. And I have, in fact, uncovered individual Canadians whose brains had been removed and spines and others. And I thought, what can I, and if journalists have asked me this question, and I fluster a little bit. I'm a one-man army. I cannot go out and mobilize the masses, and I'm not sure I would want to. And I think this is part of a larger debate that I think the book has sparked a little bit on what is the obligation to the fallen here in terms of these body parts, which clearly have been destroyed. Do we change the headstones for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstones? I don't think so. Do we put up new plaques? Does McGill need to say something about this? I was just down there lecturing a couple of weeks ago. They have pathological samples there. They still use them. Maud Abbott's hearts and other things. And they use them because they're still useful, to come back to your question, sir. They're useful for teaching. I think the problem here in my mind, and I would love to hear from you as well, is that this was a story that I don't think was suppressed, although clearly in 1922, D&D doesn't want these things. And the fact that they were not, that the next of kin did not know about this, that I think certainly wasn't troubling at the time for doctors, but today it certainly is. And we put a lot of effort into still finding the fallen. When we discover the remains of a Canadian soldier, we mobilize. And a lot of people are involved in that. Colleagues at the Department of National Defense, Director of History and Heritage. We feel an obligation to find out who that young man was and to rebury him and to tell his family if we can. Should we do the same here? Are body parts that were extracted for medical study the same as fallen soldiers who have no grave? I'm not sure, but I certainly would be willing to be a part of that conversation. You had a question, sir, but is there anyone else? Yes. No, they encountered gangrene in massive doses for the first time. Putting aside the Crimean War, those are not the same doctors. So infection, and why are they encountering infection? It is because, of course, the soil of Flanders and France has been impregnated with human and animal feces for centuries. So that is the great challenge that they faced, and it remained a challenge throughout the war. Yes. Yes. Right. Yeah, great question. Well, as a historian, I'm often looking backwards, not often looking forward. But I do think that there have been, as we now know, vaccine hesitancy, I don't like that word, but people who have been opposed to vaccinations throughout our history. There's riots in Montreal in 1885 when smallpox is ripping through that city and killing thousands of people. There were some debates in Canada during the war. There was a much stronger anti-vaccination group in Britain during the war. And it was one of the reasons why they didn't mandatorily vaccinate British soldiers until much later in the war. It's an area of study that, and this is sometimes the cheap out of most historians. Oh, it's a great question, but we need more study. But it is an area that needs more study of how do vaccinations work in the Canadian Forces over time. I think of our Canadians, just as one example, who went to the Gulf War and who had to endure a number of vaccinations, some of which they have said have caused permanent damage. I think of during the Second World War, the anti-malarial vaccinations that were very damaging and remain very damaging for anyone who takes those. So there are issues here, and yet vaccinations save soldiers' lives and are part of force prevention, especially when you bring together large groups into small spaces. And I think that is something there. But it's a great question, and I hope my book does contribute to that. But as far as I know, no one has ever written on this, and so maybe they'll read something here and want to explore it in a longer study that passes through the Second War, Korea, peacekeeping missions, Afghanistan, and perhaps beyond. Yes, sir. Yeah. Piling up. Oh, question. Oh, yeah. Good.
I love many of the images you shared in the book, like you, Tim. I am well acquainted. Each of the 4,600 images captured by Castle, Noble, and Ryder. My apologies if I mispronounced. I also love that you identified Major Rhea of number 3 McGill on page 146, and was wondering if you had also read that Captain Lloyd Phillips McAfee had proceeded to Bonn, Germany, collect samples in January 1919.
That is a very well-informed person. But yes, McAfee is in the book, and gathered up, I forget, 750 body parts. He was a dedicated medical officer who was instructed at the end of the war to gather up artifacts, medical artifacts, and body parts. It's really kind of fascinating. I, as a curator and working in this great museum, to think about, this is a story about museums that's never been told, but I think it's an interesting story. Sir Arthur Doughty, the public archivist at the time, was gathering up war trophies. Lord Beaverbrook, many of you know I have a great passion for Beaverbrook, created the war art program and photography and historians and film. And I often think, where would we have been without Beaverbrook? We'd be using British photographs and British film here. And so this is a fascinating story, and thank you for the great question. And there's a little bit in the book on that.
I'm going to jump in again. Find it quite as awful as you. Dead is dead, and if there is some sort of legacy for these young men, I'm glad. I see it as rather on the same plane as the unknown soldier. I'm glad you keep things in historical context. We rarely can know more than our own context.
A great question and comment. And I think, again, thinking about the fallen and what we owe to them in a broad sense. I have always felt, I only speak for myself, I believe there is a debt. One of the most powerful elements of that debt is remembrance and teaching and learning. That's what this museum does. That's what I do as a historian. There are other forms, obviously. The debt owed to the wounded is to care for them in body, in mind, spiritually. There is a debt, I think, of commemoration. We see that in memorials and monuments. But there are other elements and ways that we think and commemorate. And one of the most challenging, and Teresa and I have talked about this, is private commemoration. How is it that families reflect on the fallen? Is it the photograph on the mantle? Is it the letters that are kept? Is it talking and evoking the memory of a cousin or uncle who never came home? That's harder history to get at, but that too, I think, lives on and helps to fulfill that debt of obligation. Yes, sir.
Oh, so sorry. Anyway, if they can't do the question.
I can repeat it.
Okay, you repeat it better. The point being is that
Autopsied on a table. Yeah.
Therefore, buried under known casualty or
Correct.
or there's now a component of that. It's a medical play, in fact, the person, like,
That's one way to think about it, I think. And so just to repeat the question, it is of the autopsied soldiers who died typically in a hospital, and during the operation to save them, it was discovered that to removing their lungs would benefit this program. That was done, and then they were buried. Of course, they buried the soldiers, and hospitals often, no, always had cemeteries around them, and those later became Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries. So yes, you're right there. These are burials of soldiers, part of soldiers, without a brain or a lung, and then the removal of their parts back to Canada. I think you could make an argument. I'm not sure you're making the argument. I think you're making the point that they are still buried. I think others might say it's still shocking to remove these body parts and to bring them back for medical study and then to unceremoniously destroy them. But I think that is, that may be falling into the realm of ethics and philosophy, which I fully welcome, but is among some of those challenges that historians face, as well as others.
okay. Thanks for the answer regarding McAfee. I also wanted to inquire about the identities of three others. On page 146, you displayed this photo of the X-ray room at number 3. Is that not Lieutenant Colonel Pitt? On page 359, is that not Captain Harold Wigmore McGill of 31st Battalion? And finally, on page 88, we know when Yvonne was in a series of photographs, was she ever identified?
All great, and I'll encourage the person to just contact me if you'd like. My email is easily found, and I always give it out, tim.cook@warmuseum.ca. Happy to hear from people. Always great to share my findings with you and to hear your stories. And isn't it great that we can return in person to have these discussions and to see one another and to ensure that that these stories are not lost. So thank you very much, everyone.
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So sorry, Louise, they're not hearing you. So could you step a little? Okay.
When I was in Chihuahua, I visited this hospital for veterans and saw veterans. And I had put that more than one veteran, veterans. allow these other things. Just to look back at that. So you never know what it's going to be. You never know what's going to mean to people. So not only is it important,
Right.
we haven't talked about that the year ago. And so it does tie to that. It builds on that. So those I just want to thank you profoundly for one and for two coming and talking about it. Now we have a little small do in the plans. We have a small Yeah.
I've got one more question here that I know you're going to want to answer. What is the fastest way to get the book?
It's available online at amazon.ca at chapters and here in our store. So thanks very much.
Okay, folks, so just before you go away, for those of you who are and here in the room, I specifically want to mention the talk coming for the month of May, third week in May on a Thursday evening. That's going to be a virtual presentation, and it will be the part 2 of a really interesting military engineer story. There's a historian out of Montreal who gave us a wonderful talk on an engineering family that goes back to the early 1700s here in Canada. And he spoke to us about the forts that family virtually were engineers and responsible for building in many of the forts in Quebec, including the Citadel. And it was a really interesting story. We're going to get part 2 of that, which will speak to that engineering family and its descendants, including the generation which had 16 military engineers that served during the First World War, of which 4 of them were generals, all coming from the same family. So it's an incredible legacy story of Canadians, and primarily in Quebec. And we encourage you certainly to join us online for that presentation in May. And we will be doing some other presentations. We're looking now to September to hopefully nab the curator of the supply line boxes again to do that presentation. And we'll make sure that we do try to stream it like this, because that's an incredible story of what the museum is doing for outreach, for children, and that we as the Friends contribute a good deal of money to. So I want to make sure that you know out there that this will be another one of these live streamed during the daytime, and that certainly will be in early September. So we are definitely trying to build a program that we can get that will be of value to both those who are here in Ottawa and also for those that are out in the hinterland. So on the basis of that, I'm going to thank you all for joining us today and hope that you'll come back again for some of our other presentations. Thanks very much.